This is Phil Coatman with an overview of cryptography. At the very highest level, the general idea of cryptography is to keep a secret by scrambling the information. More specifically, there's some original piece of data called the plaintext that is then run through an encryption algorithm. So encryption converts the plaintext into ciphertext, where ciphertext is the data after the encryption occurs. The point of performing the encryption is that no one except the intended recipient is able to take the ciphertext and convert it back to plaintext to be able to read it. A key concept in knowing whether encryption is good or not is whether it displays the avalanche effect. In an avalanche effect, there are two pieces. The first is confusion. Confusion means that multiple bits in the plaintext are combined to make a ciphertext bit. That means that ideally, each bit of the ciphertext output changes if any one of any of the bits of the input plaintext are changed. The other side of that same coin is diffusion. Diffusion works sort of the other way. Each bit of plaintext affects many of the bits of ciphertext. In particular, what you'd like is if a single bit of the plaintext changes, then all the bits of the ciphertext change. For mathematical purists, all these changes are with probability 0.5. What this amounts to is that the ciphertext is a random function of the plaintext bits. In other words, good encryption looks like a random number generator that takes all the input plaintext bits in, produces a pseudorandom number as an output in the form of ciphertext, and unless you know some secret, you're not able to reverse the process to get from ciphertext back to plaintext. There are some common anti-patterns for poor use of cryptography. One is using a homemade cryptographic algorithm. Simplistic algorithms can be broken, and you need to use professionally available, publicly scrutinized algorithms to have any chance of making your cryptography good. The next one is using private keys when a public key algorithm is required, and we'll explain what that means. And the last one is not thinking about key distribution during the design process, where keys are the secret that enables you to convert the plaintext to ciphertext and back. Computation-based cryptography has been around for a couple thousand years. A classic early cipher is a substitution cipher called the Caesar cipher after Julius Caesar. The mechanism you can see on the left of the slide is used to encrypt messages. It has two wheels, and one wheel spins while the other stays the same. You set the cipher by setting the letter A on the inner wheel to match some letter on the outer wheel. The key to the cipher, the secret key, is which letter the A is lined with when you begin encryption. In the photograph, the letter A converts to the letter N. The idea behind a Caesar cipher is that each letter of the plaintext, the input, is substituted with another letter in the ciphertext. So for example, where the wheel is set, an A goes to an N, a Z goes to an O, and so on. As we can see, the action of a Caesar cipher is to replace each plaintext letter with a different one a certain number of letters away. As an example, if all the letters are shifted one, the letters IBM become HAL. There are 26 different wheel positions in a classic Caesar cipher, which gives you somewhere between a 4 or a 5-bit key. In order to break this cipher by brute force, you would take all 26 possible wheel positions, translate the ciphertext back into plaintext with each of the 26 wheel positions, and see which one resulted in plaintext that made sense. That kind of brute force attack takes a long time when you're on pencil and paper. With computers, it's straightforward. But there's a more sophisticated way to attack the cipher. The more sophisticated way is to look at the letter frequency. In the English language, the letters E, T, A, and O are the most frequent letters. As long as you have a fairly large amount of ciphertext, you can look at the individual letters. For example, you might have a lot of N's and say, wait a minute, N's are pretty common. That's probably E or T or A. And you might have a lot of J's and say, well, J's are extremely common. Maybe that's the letter E. Just doing a count of the different letters in the ciphertext will pretty quickly lead you to which wheel setting there is without trial and error. Basically, you're likely to get it right on the first try unless the words in the plaintext have very unusual letter combinations and letter frequencies. These days, The Caesar cipher is great for kids, but not serious cryptography. But it does illustrate how substitution works and the issue of vulnerability to frequency analysis. A couple additional observations. The first is that the confusion and diffusion is limited because each letter turns into another letter independent of all the other letters in the message. The other is it gives secrecy but not explicit integrity. If somebody modifies one of the letters of the ciphertext, they can make it turn into some other letter. They may or may not know what that letter is, but there's no way to tell that a letter's been changed except by looking at the decrypted plaintext and noticing some of the words are misspelled. So there's no explicit integrity check to see if it's been changed, but there may be an implicit one in terms of detecting misspelled words. So that means you might be able to tell that a message has been altered if it results in an English sentence, but it's going to be very hard if you're trying to encrypt a series of numbers in which it's hard to tell if a digit has been changed or not. A famous cryptographic system from World War II is the complex substitution cipher known as the German Enigma machine. You can see an example of the Enigma machine, which has several pieces. It has a keyboard, and messages were entered one letter at a time on a keyboard. It has rotors, in this case it's a 3-rotor model, and the rotors were set at some initial position, so they're wheels that spin. There's a plug board that has some wires that were connected in various patterns to further scramble the message. And then there's a lamp board which displays illuminated lights with the output of the encryption process. So with an Enigma machine, the message was entered one letter at a time. And as a key was pressed, an electrical signal from that key would go through the 3 rotors, and each time it went through a rotor, it would be scrambled from one position to another position based on the rotor design and the rotor orientation. It would go down to the plug board and then be fed back around to run through the rotors again in an opposite direction. At the end, it would then illuminate a light on the lamp board. After each key press, the rotors would spin using a different substitution for each letter. It turns out that while running the signal through the rotors twice intuitively scrambled it more, that resulted in a weakness in the machine, because they had a system in which the letter that went in would always come out to be a different letter at the output, and therefore slightly non-random because there's a bias away from having one letter come out to be itself. That was necessary for the electronic working of the machine, but it turned out to provide a wedge to break the encryption. Breaking the Enigma machine was done using electrical-mechanical computers called bombs. Here are some photographs of the front and the back side of a recreated bomb at the museum at Bletchley Park. This is an operating machine, and when you watch it operate, what you see is each set of 3 rotors spins away until it finds what looks like a match to the message. If you've seen the movie The Imitation Game, this is the kind of machine that you saw in the movie. Also built during World War II was Colossus, the first stored program computer. This computer was built to break the German High Command Lorenz cipher, which is more complicated than the Enigma, but required equipment that was harder to conveniently fit in a field tent or inside a submarine as Enigma was used. Breaking Lorenz required building a computer out of vacuum tube technology that did statistical analysis of radio intercepts. Vacuum tubes were used in those days the way we would use transistors now to make a computer. This photo of the front side of Colossus shows some accumulators, so the horizontal white modules are counters, and they're counting up the statistical information inside the message, and eventually this was broken using statistics not all that different than what we applied to the Caesar cipher. But because the scrambling was highly effective, it required a lot of trial and error and a lot of processing to try and decide which letters were going to which other letters. Inside the machine is a mass of wires and some vacuum tubes, and you can see the size of this machine. It's considerably taller than I am, and it occupies an entire room. By the way, if you're interested in these types of machines and cryptography in general, I highly recommend going to Bletchley Park if you happen to be visiting London and have an extra day. Take the train up to Bletchley Park, see both the Bletchley Park Museum and also the next door Computer Museum, and you'll get to see the Enigma machine in the first one and Colossus in the second one. After World War II, modern cryptography was born with the advent of digital computers. A classic algorithm from 1975 was the data encryption standard DES. DES worked by breaking data to be encrypted into 64-bit blocks, so encrypted messages 64 bits at a time, which allowed the confusion and diffusion of the algorithm to affect blocks of 64 bits instead of just blocks of 6 or 7 or 8-bit characters. DES used a 56-bit secret key to control the encryption and decryption by selecting different scrambling functions. The picture on the right of the slide shows how DES works. The inputs came down from the top, and then the input would go through a scrambling function F and be XORed into the message, and the results would then go down to the next scrambling function and so on. There would be 16 rounds of scrambling, and you get the ciphertext at the end. 56 bits might seem a little odd. You ask, why isn't it 64? Well, presumably the key size was chosen so that only the National Security Agency could brute force or otherwise break 56-bit keys. That's a philosophy known as NOBUS, nobody but us, and historically the United States has encouraged the adoption of cryptography, which the US thinks that it can break, but it thinks that no one else has the resources or money or knowledge to be able to break. DES, as far as we know, was unbroken by anyone but the NSA until 1998. In 1998, some researchers took about $250,000 of field programmable gate arrays and were able to brute force all 2 to the 56 DES keys in a few days, and at that point, the algorithm had been publicly broken. Whether or not some other intelligence agency of some other country had broken it before then remains an open question. An important lesson to take away from all this is that all these algorithms we've seen were created, and at the time they were effective, or people thought they were effective, and then they were broken. It gets more complicated and more expensive to break them, but eventually every cryptographic algorithm designed has been broken by suitable application of being clever and a lot of computational resources. That means when you use another cryptographic algorithm, the question is not whether it will be broken, but rather when. That brings us to current-day cryptography. The current standard is the Advanced Encryption Standard AES from 2001. One of the important lessons learned with the experience from DES was that eventually computers will be fast enough to brute force a particular key size. For that reason, AES was designed to be able to accept more than one length of key. And the idea is that over time, as computers to break the encryption get faster, you can just use a bigger key size to make brute force attacks of trying all possible keys computationally unaffordable. So baseline DES breaks the data to be encrypted into 128-bit blocks and uses a secret key of 128 bits. But over time, as computers have become faster, people have shifted from 128-bit keys to 192-bit keys or even 256-bit keys. So when you say AES-256, that means AES with a 256-bit key. Note that as you double the number of bits, you need exponentially more computer power to use a brute force attack because a 256-bit key is not twice the number of keys as a 128-bit key, but rather it's 2 to the 128th times more possible keys. The precise details aren't super important for our purposes, but let's take a quick tour of how AES works. It first substitutes some byte values. It then shifts the rows of bytes. It then multiplies each column by a matrix using mixed columns. These are all steps that provide confusion and diffusion. Finally, it XORs the result with a secret key, and that's the piece you need to be able to reverse the process. As far as we know, AES is still okay as long as you use a big enough key size. Up to this point, all the encryption algorithms we've looked at use the same key to encrypt and decrypt. Those are called symmetric key cryptographic systems because the encryption and decryption are mirror images of each other using the same key. There's some significant disadvantages to that. The big one is that you somehow would have to get that secret key to someone else who might be on the other side of the world. To get around that problem, you can use public key cryptography. Public key cryptography uses asymmetric key pairs, and what that means is the sender and the receiver have different cryptographic keys. Now, you can't use any old key. You have to use specially constructed keys. In particular, there's a public key, which is not secret. In other words, part of the key you can tell to everyone, including the adversaries. So that's a public key. It's not secret at all. You can post it on the web, attach it to your email, anything you want. But there's also a private key. And the private key is a secret key known only to the key owner and not even to the message recipient. Now, how in the world can you get someone to talk to someone else if neither one knows the other's secret key? Well, you can do it if the public key and the private key have a special mathematical relationship. So if Bob wants to talk to Alice and they exchange public keys, it works as long as the public keys and each of Bob's and Alice's private keys have a special relationship. At a high level, the simple version is you could have a public key based on the product of two prime numbers. So Bob picks two prime numbers and they're both secret. He multiplies them together and he gives the product as his public key. It turns out that factoring really large prime numbers is computationally infeasible. So he can put that public key out there and no one else will have the computational power to figure out what his secret prime factors are. Alice would do the same thing with different secret keys and they'd exchange public keys. Since nobody can factor these public keys, they're out there in public. Maybe the message is hello Alice in the picture and Bob encrypts it using Bob's secret key and Alice's public key. So Bob has a prime factor that only he knows, and he uses that as well as Alice's public key, which is a product of two prime factors only she knows. The encrypted message is sent over a public visible channel. Alice then uses Bob's public key, which is a product of two prime numbers, and her own private key, which is a factor of her public key, to decrypt the message. The nice thing about this is that once the message has been encrypted, only Bob could have sent it and only Alice can read it. Even if you're an attacker and you know Alice's public key, you can't decrypt it because to decrypt it you need her private key, which you can't get because you don't have enough computational power to factor these huge primes. Now there's a catch here. This is computationally expensive and it requires huge key sizes. Typically you'll see in the old days 1024-bit keys, but now it's more likely 2048-bit keys or maybe even 3072-bit keys for a long-lived embedded system. Not every key works because the only valid public keys at these huge sizes have to be products of two primes. So the key space is relatively sparse, a lot of values aren't valid keys, and in order to break this, you don't need to try all possible 2 to the 3072-bit keys to break it. You only need to find a prime factor that divides it, and the primes are about half the number of bits, so you only have to attack about 1500 bits to be able to factor a 3072-bit key. That's still a lot of computation, but because of the structure of these public keys, something like 256 bits just won't get the job done. Again, the cool part of this algorithm is that you can get two people who've never met and have never exchanged keys to be able to communicate with each other as long as they know the other person's public key. To this point, we've been using cryptography to scramble messages to ensure secrecy. But there's another use for cryptography, and that's ensuring message integrity. The difference between secrecy and integrity is with secrecy, nobody can read your message. But that doesn't mean they can't change your message. So if you have the ciphertext and somebody intercepts it and modifies it, that ciphertext will decrypt into some plaintext that has been modified. And there are some cryptographic systems where it's pretty easy to modify it in a really malicious way. Think about a bank account transfer where you know a certain part of the message is a dollar amount. You can modify that and it'll change to be a different dollar amount. Now you might not know exactly what dollar amount you've put in, but what you do know is you've changed the dollar amount, and unless something else is done, the receiver won't know that it's been changed. Also, sometimes you don't actually care about secrecy. What you care about is integrity. For example, if you're ensuring that a software image is downloaded to a system without being changed, it might not matter what the binary code image is, but it might matter a lot to make sure no one's changed it. So for those kind of applications, you don't want secrecy, you want integrity, and that's what secure hashing and digital signatures do. With these approaches, cryptography is used to ensure integrity via creating a digest. Now, what's a digest? Well, a non-secure digest is a checksum or CRC used to ensure message integrity. The reason I say those are non-secure is it's very easy to computationally break and recreate or forge a CRC, even if the polynomial for the CRC is secret. So don't do that. CRCs are not secure. But it's the same idea. You take a large message, you create a pseudo-random, smaller version digest of the message as a way to say, all right, if this digest matches what you would expect from the big message, then no one's changed the message. So the catch is we want to do that in a secure way. There's a huge advantage to using this type of hashing or signature approach compared to encryption, and that is usually get a blanket export exemption because you're not trying to keep secrets, even though you're using strong cryptographic algorithms. We'll come back to that in another lecture. First, let's look at symmetric cryptography, which can create hashing functions. You take an input, you run a cryptographic hash function on it. Basically, you encrypt it, but instead of taking the full message as the output, you combine all the values of the output into a smaller digest. Maybe you just XOR them all together into a short version of the message. The same secret key is used to check validity, but instead of decrypting it, what you do is you receive the input, you receive a digest next to it, and the sender computes the digest across the input and sends the digest. The receiver gets the same input, the receiver computes the digest, and if the received digest matches the digest computed by the receiver, that means the message has not been altered. So if you know about checksums and CRCs, this is exactly the same idea. The only difference is that instead of using a checksum or CRC, we're using a symmetric, cryptographically secure function to generate our hash. Both the sender and receiver must have the same secret key, and that means the receiver can also forge a signature because they have the key. If you're worried about the receiver not being able to forge signatures, you switch to asymmetric cryptography and use a signing process. This is exactly the same idea, except the secret key is used to create the digest and the public key is used to check validity. With signing, the receiver cannot forge a signature, but because it's asymmetric public key cryptography, it's going to be more expensive. If you wanted to implement secure hashing or signing, you could use, for example, AES for the symmetric cryptography and some public key algorithm for the asymmetric cryptography. Public key cryptography might seem like magic, and in a way, it kind of is. Two people who have never met and have never exchanged keys can communicate in a secure way that no one else can break. But there's a catch. The catch is when Bob communicates with Alice, if they've never communicated before, he'll say, "Hi Alice, my name is Bob, and here's my public key. I'm sending you a message." And sure enough, Alice can be sure by the fact that the message successfully decrypts into something intelligible that it was really the person who says he's Bob who sent it. But how does she know whether that's the Bob she thinks it is? It could be someone else who just claims he's Bob. So there's an issue with public key cryptography that you know someone who says they're Bob sent it, but you don't know whether or not that's actually the person you think it is. So there's an authentication problem. You know it got sent from someone, but you don't know whether it's authentically the person you thought it was. Solving this requires another mechanism, and the general purpose mechanism in use on the internet is public key infrastructure, PKI. Here's how it works. There's a thing called a digital certificate. A digital certificate binds identity with a public key. So if Bob says, "Hey, my name is Bob, and here's my public key," Bob not only sends you the public key, but also sends you a certificate that says, this certificate is owned by Bob, and it's the Bob you think it is, and this certificate is also associated with the public key. So if you can trust the digital certificate, you know that whoever says they're Bob is really Bob, and more importantly, that's their key. Now to get there, you have a somewhat complicated process. It involves 3 different players. The first is you need a certificate authority. This entity generates asymmetric key pairs, and it sends the owner of the key pair a private key and sends the validation authority, which we'll get to in a minute, the public key. So if you're Bob and you want to prove to everyone else you're Bob, you go to the CA and you say, "Could you please give me a key pair?" And the CA says, "Here's your private key. And by the way, here's your public key, and I'm going to let everyone know, part 1, that this is your public key, and part 2, that you are who you are, by sending this information to other folks." But wait, how does the CA know you're really Bob? If you're really clever and can lie to the CA that you're Bob the first time, now you can be Bob forever. Well, that problem's handled by the registration authority, the RA. The RA checks personal documents such as passports against the person for the CA. So if you get this kind of public key, you actually have to hand over a copy of your passport or otherwise prove you're you by showing up in person and so on to the RA. So the RA checks your identity and then says to the CA, hey, this person that said they were Bob, it's really Bob, and it's the person they say they are. And the CA can then say, okay, fine, here's your asymmetric key pair, and we'll put the public key to the VA. Now there's a third piece. How does Alice know what Bob's public key really is? How does she get a copy of the digital certificate? Because Bob could have just made up a digital certificate. Well, Alice goes to the validation authority, the VA, which has a database of identity and public key pairs, which are digitally signed by the CA. Okay, so now what's happening is the VA says, everyone who wants to know, here's Bob's public key, and this is the Bob we're talking about. And that information is signed by the VA so that everyone knows that if you trust the VA to sign things, then it really is the identity public key pair of Bob. And we know it's Bob because the RA decided it was Bob, and the CA trusts the RA, and the CA generated the keys and fed the keys to the VA. So it's a little bit complicated to set up, but when you're done with the initial part, really the entity who does the heavy lifting is the VA, because once the identity public key pair is set up, all that happens is everyone queries the VA to make sure that the person saying they're Bob is really Bob. Also, if you want to talk to Bob and you never even exchanged messages, you can go look up Bob's public key at the VA and send a message and already know the public key. One of the issues that can happen is that a key gets compromised. For example, someone breaks into Bob's computer and steals his private key. So the VA also has the ability to do key revocation, saying, oh, wait a minute, this key is going compromised, it's no longer valid, you have to try this other key. Now the subtle point here is, why did we need to sign the identity public key pairs? Well, one of the reasons is that you might cache local copies or distribute local copies. And so you don't actually need online access to the VA. All you need is the ability to check a digital signature to make sure that the identity public key pair is legitimate. Now that we've looked at symmetric key and asymmetric keys and PKI, we can now talk about what kind of things need to go into an embedded device. An embedded device needs to be provisioned from the factory with some secret keys. Ideally, each device has a unique random secret key that's different for that device, and that's going to be a way to do public key cryptography. It should also have a manufacturer public key so that it can look at firmware images and know that a firmware image has been signed by the manufacturer to check its integrity. Now, the manufacturer public key can be the same on every device because if you're using digital signatures, knowing that public key does not enable you to forge different program images. So the way you would use this is the device secret key would be used to encrypt outgoing messages. Obviously that's coupled with a public key, but the secret is the part you have to keep secret. There's probably also a device signed public key to tell the factory your public key. So this is a public key signed by the factory that you can send back to the factory in communications to say, hey, I'm device number 73. And by the way, here's my public key. And because you, the factory, signed it before I was manufactured, you know that I'm not lying to you about being device 73. Sometimes companies say, oh, that's okay, we'll keep a database of all the public keys of all our devices, but those databases always have a problem. They go stale, something gets scrambled, data gets lost. It's much smarter to have each device be able to tell the factory its public key than to try and keep a record. And there's also a factory public key, which is used to receive messages and updates from the factory. So you have a secret key to encrypt outgoing messages, a public key for the device that the factory's already signed so the factory can say, yes, you're one of the family, and a factory public key so that you can verify firmware updates and other messages. Once you've provisioned the device with these secrets, you can then use standard ways of doing key exchange and bootstrapping communications. Typically what you see is an initial exchange of messages is done with an asymmetric cryptographic algorithm using public keys. Now that's computationally expensive, so you don't want to send a lot of data that way, but what you do send is you send a couple messages up front to set up a randomly selected symmetric key. Alternately, you can use a public cryptography-based key agreement protocol such as Diffie-Hellman. This picture uses an analogy with paint colors to say there's a common paint and a secret color, and you can send these paints through the mail, and even if everyone knows what the color is, they can't separate out the secret from the common paint. And then using this color exchange, you can agree on a common shared secret. Obviously, that's an analogy. You would perform that message exchange. When you're done, you're left with a random number known to both sides and no one else. You then use that as a key for a symmetric cryptographic channel. Those are called session keys because each communication session you generate another random key and use that for the duration of the session. While this tutorial covered the basics of cryptography, there's a lot here to understand. It's a complete college course to even get anywhere near to hitting all the details. So think of this as a survey of the topic. And if you need to know more, there's plenty of online material to dive deeper. Summing up, here are some best practices for cryptography. Use well-known standard cryptographic algorithms. If you make up your own algorithm, somebody will probably be able to break it. If you can use private key cryptography, you should use it because it's faster, takes fewer computational resources. But the downside is both sides have the key and you have to securely transfer the keys between the two parties, which may not be practical in some cases. Public key cryptography has a lot of advantages. One of them is you don't need to exchange keys via courier or secret channel. The other is that there's no sender key to caption the receiver. So if you have an embedded system with lots of products, you don't want to use the same private symmetric key to communicate with the factory, because if somebody buys one of your products and reverse engineers it, now they can decrypt all the traffic between any device in the factory. So for most embedded devices, you really need public key cryptography, so each individual system has a different secret. That having been said, you typically use this with a public key to set up a communication channel and the private key to run the heavy lifting during a particular session. Make sure you use a large enough key. The number of bits you need in a key depends on how long your product lives. Embedded systems often live a really long time, so you usually want to pick one of the longest keys that your software supports. You also have to deal with key management and key revocation in case some of the factory keys get compromised. Use hashing and digital signature when possible. You don't always need secrecy. Sometimes you only need integrity, and when you do, you should be using hashing and digital signatures as appropriate rather than encryption. The big pitfalls in cryptography are assuming that you have some homemade cryptographic algorithm you designed yourself and that it's secure. It's not. It's insecure if you designed it yourself. Another pitfall is how you use encryption is kind of tricky. You should not be designing your own methods to send messages back and forth and establish secrets. You should use only publicly vetted cryptographic protocols. And the last one is that apparently cryptographic algorithms and books can have bugs, subtle bugs, things that compromise security. So instead of trying to write the code yourself from the algorithms, you should get an up-to-date maintained crypto library from a reputable source. Type of thing you need to leave not only to professionals, but professionals who've had a lot of public scrutiny and cross-checked with other professionals. In other words, kids, don't try this at home.